Good morning, everyone. So today we'll be discussing of form and space in relation to positive and negative space. So what I uploaded earlier was the architectural samples of it. Now we'll be dealing more with interior specification. So hopefully you get the feel on how it is applied in how negative and positive spaces shape interior, and that these would actually give a more experiential approach to design. Okay, so form in relation is the shape and structure of something that as distinguished from its substance or material. So space is a three-dimensional field in which objects and events occur and have relative position and direction. So especially a proportion of a field set, a part in the given instance, or for a particular purpose. So space encompasses our being. Through the volume of space, we see, we move, we hear sounds, um, we experience the space in its totality. So material substance like wood or stone, it inherently has a formless vapor. So its visual form, its dimensions and scale, and the quality of its light. So all of these quantities depend on our perception of the spatial boundaries defined by the elements of form. So I think with design, we have to take consideration natural elements that uh, would actually reflect or take part in any interior space. So as so elements of nature such as fire through, let's say, translated through light, water translated into let's say natural elements like landscape, and then earth would come, let's say, translate into a material approach. So the solidity of earth then translated into, let's say, wood, concrete, and the rest. So as space begins to be captured, enclosed, molded, and organized by the elements of mass, architecture, or built environment comes into being. So architecture is the thoughtful making of space, and then space therefore is the fundamental of interior design. Okay, so these are samples of how negative and positive applications of light taking form into a space. So this is very typical in Renaissance architecture where you have open with this vast structure. You have, let's say, a light or through an oculus or a transom window. So this would actually bring, let's say, a positive effect on any interior space. Okay. So form and space. So the unity of opposites. Our visual field normally consists of heterogeneous elements. It differ in shape, size, color, or orientation. So there are different elements that play in any interior or built environment. So to better comprehend the structure of a visual field, we tend to organize its elements into two opposing groups. So you have your positive elements, which are perceived as figures, and negative elements, which provides a background for the figures. So I think everyone is informed about like the negative and positive space. So positive elements are the things that take up the space, and the space itself will be your, um, let's say, background or your base design for any elements that would take form. Okay, so as it grows in size in its relative field, other elements would begin to compete for its attention in figures. So, for example, with this first element, you have a lot of negative space. Therefore, it directs your eye to that positive element, so which is taking form. So, same as it increases in size, it will compete around with the surrounding elements. So, as um, As it enlarges, so it grows in size. As you can see here, it would be perceived as the A would be the space that the A is the form that's taking up the rest of the space. So same for this one. So it would be perceived as different elements. This one would be taken, the letter A is taking up this would be the negative space in relation to the dark positive space. So it competes for our attention. So these are examples of figure ground. So this is where the visual perception would take place. So with here, so you can see that black um, is competing with the white. So this could be the positive space. The white could be the positive space against a black background, or the black be the positive space in the white background. So same for this one as well. So would it? This is very prominent in any visual perceptions and visual perceptions in design. So, or even in art as well. So you have here with whether, if you think about it, if you look into black as your positive space, then it will be understood that it is a vase against a white background. But if you look at the or the white as your positive space, then it will be perceived as a face with a black background. Okay. So figure ground relationship. So our perception and understanding of composition depends on how we interpret the visual interaction between the positive and negative elements within its field. So this is one good example of how to interpret that. So it depends on your visual interaction. So how you perceive these figures. So at times, the relationship between figure and their background is so ambiguous that we visually switch their identities back and forth almost simultaneously. So this is understood in these figures. This is especially when we're thinking about psychology and the understanding of your visual perception. These would come into mind. Okay, so plan diagrams of Taj Mahal. So the line, basically here, the line is the defining boundary between solid mass and the spatial void. The form of solid mass is rendered as a figure, and this one, the form of the spatial void, is rendered as a figure. So it depends on your visual perception or how you see things. So architectural form occurs at the juncture between mass and space. And in executing and reading design drawings, you should be concerned with width of the form or the mass is containing a volume of space. So this would actually train your eye into perceiving things visually. So I think in design planning, you have to consider the positive and the negative spaces that would contribute to the overall composition of your design. So if you're very fond of maps or geography, you would actually consider you would actually you would actually notice the positive and negative spaces determined by, let's say, structure, open spaces, and roadways. So that is very prominent in any, let's say, planning. So you see your negative spaces or your positive spaces or the buildings or structure that uh, take space or take take away space in a larger scale. Right. So the symbiotic relationship of form and mass in architecture can be examined and found to exist in different scales. So um, we'll just show you samples of how these are applied into an architectural setting. This is very also prominent in any interior design planning. So when we think of design and positive and negative spaces, so I'll just look into B for an example for interior space. For this one, so this is your space. Adding up partitions, built-in cabinets would actually take on positive space or taking up space in that negative plane. So there. So this would serve as your background, and these items would would be your elements, or your, let's say, your elements or your positive space. So for this, so in plan, um, let's go to example C. In plan, so this would, the space around, or let's say the land around it, would contribute to that of a negative space. Any built up or any structure would be a part of your positive space. So for example, this one as well. So this would be your ground. So this is um, the courtyard or the courtroom would serve as your positive space or the volume, and the central portion, which is the opening, would be your negative space. So, alright. So these are other examples. So there. So it depends. So this would be a stand free within its site, extend exterior spaces to merge with private exterior spaces for this one. And then this is positive form in a negative space. So you have this plot of land, and then you build structures in, I think this is in a repetitive form. So this is very typical in developments in which you have a blank plot of land and you build around it. So whether you develop this into a landscape, or maybe add a secondary structure, then it would actually take up positive space. Okay. View the configurations of wall as positive elements on the plan. So in any plan, for example, this plan, anything that cuts through within that, let's say, this space, which was just allotted for the structure, would actually contribute to the to the positive space. So the white space in between should, however, not be simply seen as a background for walls, but also figures. So it would determine shape and form. So in plan, so whenever you're coming up with furniture layouts, so any plan that is determined by the space would contribute to your negative or your background form. Any element would actually create that positive element in that negative space. So this is an example on how you would frame furniture in a space. So for this one, so changes in background or material application would actually help you define the spatial field, or the perception of rooms. So positive is equal negative, um, so it is equals to negative. Your figure is equal to the ground and the plane where it will be placed. Your solid should have a balance with your void, and your form should have a balance with the space. So with defining spaces, we have to consider elements that would, but to create this balancing uh, sense of balance in interior application. So this is one example on how you develop spaces with the use of materiality and planar application. So with this space, you have a solid base. You have to balance your application with a uh, lighter sense of elements. So to create this visual, it depends on the function of the space, or it depends on what experience are you trying to translate. So with this, you have a solid ground, which enables it to feel a bit more cozy, very cave-like, in relation to this accentuated ceiling. You have high ceiling to accentuate these elements. You have a lighter application with the walls. Make the thin and delicate and intricate lines would create the visual appeal that it is light, and in comparison that it draws your eye into the central part of the interior space. So with this one, you have this um, negative space. This is positive space, and then you have this open negative space in which your treatment is addressed. Okay, so Form and closure of the space in a building determines or is determined by the form of its space around it. So this is very typical in architectural or in planning, where this would be your land plot, and then any structure or any form or element that would take shape in the space is a form or a positive element in a negative space. So vertical elements in defining space. So in the previous section of this chapter, so horizontal planes defined fields of space in which vertical boundaries were implied rather than implicitly described. So vertical forms as a greater presence. So vertical forms as a greater presence in a visual field than horizontal planes and therefore more instrumental in defining a discrete volume of space and providing a sense of enclosure. So that's why you perceived your walls as enclosures. So vertical elements of forms also play important roles in the construction of architectural forms and spaces, and as they serve as structural support for roof and roof planes. So this is very visible in our building structures and any construction that would be applied therefore in site. So one of the oldest construction form is your post and lintel. So where basically you have these vertical supports up and then a horizontal plane as your structural support. So that's just basically your columns and your beams. Okay. So one example is your single vertical plane. So it is a plane that articulates the space on which it fronts. So this is very visible through hotel lobbies or anything that you want to separate or create a section of the space for. So for this one, you're creating this visual accent as your vertical plane. So therefore, it's drawing your eye, and it accentuates the space or the lobby. So this one as well. So sometimes the vertical forms sections the space, so it actually covers up the rest, or it actually creates a barrier, in which this is in this particular photo it is actually designed. So to cover up maybe the transition of this lobby towards the hallway. So with this one, it is placed on the back of a like staircase. So vertical linear elements. So these vertical linear elements define the perpendicular edges of a volume of space. So this is very, let's say, prominent in structural buildings. If you strip off all the walls in a building, you see the structural support. So these are the repetition of vertical elements that could actually be accentuated design to any space. So you have your L-shaped plane. So an L-shaped configuration of vertical planes generates a field of space from its corner, so outward diagonal axis. So this one, you have your L-shaped plane in relation to this kitchen wall. So you have this plane in which it encloses the space. So this is your general field, and this actually accentuated with windows on each end. So for this application, you have this L counter for the kitchen, in which it creates a field of space for cooking. So this one would actually be perceived as an opening, given it is through and through. So this has a solid plane in which it encloses or separates this space to this space outside the kitchen counter. So parallel planes. So these are two parallel planes define a volume of space between that is oriented actually both open ends of a configuration. So as you can see, so this is one way of applying it. So these are parallel planes. So it creates a visual, it draws you in, creates a visual interest in which draws your eye with this central point of element. So with this one, so it actually it draws your eyes towards both the end, and that it draws your eyes up to the opening. So same with this one as well. So the U-shaped plane, so a U-shaped configuration of vertical planes define a volume of a space that is oriented primarily towards the open end of the configuration. So for example, this one, so this is actually a U-shaped plane in relation and together with a courtyard. So that you have, it draws your eyes to this open end of the configuration. So it draws your eyes here to the central portion in which it is a spiral staircase. So four planes, so this is enclosure. So four vertical planes establish the boundaries of an introverted space. So it creates an enclosure. For this application, you can use different materials as to how you want to enclose the plane. Here we used a curtain to enclose the space to create a boundary form of enclosure on this particular interior. So for this, you have your vertical linear elements such as a column or obelisk uh, or a tower. So it establishes a point on the ground plane to make it visible in space. So this is one very interesting application in which out of the vastness of the space you have a singular slender element, linear element in relation to a massive scale of stone, I think, column on the right side. So with this, you have any number of horizontal axes that can be made to pass through it. So you can actually create a lot of point. So you can have a lot of points there, right? So okay, so no volume of space can be established without the definition of its edges and corners. So in any architectural element, you can establish this using columns or any linear structural support. So with this one, it is, as you can see, this is it creates a limit. So this is more or less your visual limits. Whenever you place a column or any vertical vertical structure, it would actually serve as a visual barrier, even if you don't have a wall in between. So even if you have even if it doesn't exist, you feel that there's a tension or there's a feel of enclosure within those spaces. Okay, so this is an interesting application of structural planes. So this is a crematorium in Germany. So the irregularity creates tension within the space. So you have spaces in which there are openings that creates a visual tension in which, as you can see, there's these like multiple groupings, and then there's this negative space. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve with regards to design, as how you want the space to evoke emotion or to create an experience. So so in this diagram or in this design in this drawing, so as you can see, it's upper um, the repetitive series of column elements along its perimeter would further strengthen the definition of the volume. So with you see here, there is a sparse application of the columns or your posts. Then by adding more or the repetition of our columns are closely in space, that will have a stronger definition of a volume. So this is, let's say, in a construction site. So this would actually entail you would actually question its strength and its support. By adding more, it creates a more structurally sound structure. So anyway, it'll be a sound structure, and then with this one, um, by adding, let's say, concrete, or you'll be pouring in concrete or bricks within that laid out structure, and then it will have a definition of a strong or a more fortified volume, or a volume or a structure. So the Taj Mahal is an example of balance between positive and negative space. So set in a wide landscape, you have these boundaries, and reflection even extends to the perception of the space. So with this, you have these vast negative space which define your landscape, and you have this positive space or your structure or your form that would take part in this vast space. So you have these forms taking up these landscapes, and these elements that would take up it would take form in a planar approach or in plan approach sa design. So a continuation, you have your L-shaped configuration of planes. So these have different, let's say, applications when it comes to interior now, given it is a more on in tune with the built environment or the interior space. So this is a plan and configuration. So you had to understand how it would relay in a structural concept or a structural or conceptual approach. So parallel vertical planes. So as shown in the previous slides. So there it is. So a pair of parallel interior walls within a building. And then you have your street. So this it depends on the application of your elements. Okay, so these are vertical planes, so that direct to the central plane. So these are vertical. So you have your vertical columnar support, which brings and draws your eyes into this central plane. So this is widely used in our religious places of worship. So we have your vertical plane, which actually creates it communicates as I think heading towards up to the heavens. So it has that surreal, heavenly connotation when it comes to translating into space. So you have your numerous vertical elements heading up to this central plane where you are greeted with open, like very large window openings to create that heavenly, like godlike experience. So the flow of space defined by parallel planes corresponds naturally to the path of a movement within a building, so along its corridors, halls, and galleries. So you have your U-shaped planes. So it's a configuration of vertical planes. So it defies a field of space. So this would be your field of space. This would be your planes in which it creates an enclosure. So these are samples of how this plane, if the plane is how you would perceive the plane upon entry or exit. So you have different applications, which I'll be showing you. So with this one, you have this architrave, which creates this element in which it really more or less like draws your eye to any, let's say, any building or any lobby. With this one, you have this vertical element drawing you near to this central point or central element. For this one, you have your vertical or your lobby vertical na plane in which draws your eyes to that center part. So you can see how application would actually differ. These are different types in which creates, let's say, a definition or continuity of the space. So with this one, so these are examples of an open end. So it's a primary aspect of virtue of its uniqueness relative to the other three planes. So it creates this continuity to have like a visual continuity from one place to the other. So as you can see, for this one, it creates that visual continuity. So this is where your entry portal would be perceived. Same with this one. So if openings are introduced to the corners of a configuration, so secondary zones will be created with a multi-directional space of field. So you have this, and you have this plan of layout of Piazza di Marco. It creates this opening like a U, which actually is an entry port towards the port. So the yacht na port. Same with this one. So it creates entry ports. So it creates different dimensions or different pathways to other parts of the, let's say, surrounding city. So four planes are encompassing a field of space. So this is how you would perceive a room. Um, this, since the field is completely enclosed, its space is naturally introverted. So your visual dominance would be within this space. So one of the enclosing spaces can be differentiated by others in form, surface articulation, or the nature of the openings within it. So openings in space defining elements, you have your windows, your passageways, or your dividers. These are partitions, even door entries. So there's um, there is no spatial or visual continuity is possible with adjacent spaces without openings. So in the enclosing of space planes on a spatial field. So doors offer entry into a room. Same with windows, and these are the prominent elements that allow continuity or visual adjacency from one room to the other. So it would actually establish the relationship between the room and the space beside it. So whenever you're considering interior design, you have to consider the adjacency of the spaces, how one space relates to the other, and how can you create a visual, like a continuous visual communication between those spaces. So when you're thinking about common areas, or from, let's say, when you want to design a foyer that would translate into the living room, and how the living room would still have the same elements to that of your kitchen. So to have that creative communication, or that active communication of visual elements, would actually um, make your space more, let's say, more continuous, or you have a balanced relationship in design, or translating those elements in design. So these are possible passageways, but not limited to. So you can actually create different openings with regards to function, with regards to design, and to regards to movement. So um, with any with any interior architecture, you have to consider the circulation and the flow of movement. So for lobbies, or for areas which entail a lot of foot traffic, you have to create a lot of entryways in which the people would actually be encouraged to roam around, to uh, go to different areas of the space. So for this one, you have more or less a perimeter entry. So you can actually walk around here to the reception, heading out to the lounge, and you have the central, let's say, central portion of the seating. But still encourages you to head outside to where the balcony is, or where the view is, in which it is a different experience in itself. So um, this is one way. So this is more on a radial approach when it comes to directing people into different spaces. So you have this visual, it's actually a visual, more or less like a visual invitation on, or like it draws your eye to this particular area, given that this is the reception. So it creates a movement, or or a flow in which tells you, visually tells you what to do next, or where to go next. So this is an example of a school building, or actually an office building, in which creates passageways, or different pathways to different departments in the space. So this is one layout as well. So with this one, you have a central lobby in which directs you to different areas of the space. So they towards the elevator lobby, and then the rest to the reception or the. So this one you have